Archives of Prasar Bharati presents the timeless treasure of golden era.
Hello friends and a warm welcome to this special edition. It's a privilege and a pleasure to welcome K. Srilata all the way from Chennai to our studios. Some of you must be familiar with Srilata's name, especially people who are into books, they are readers, since Srilata is a poet, a novelist, a translator, and an academician, and many of her books have won international acclaim. Srilata, welcome to our studios.
Thank you.
Your latest book, This Kind of Child, the disability story, we would like to make this the protagonist of our little interaction here. But the larger idea is to know you more holistically as a creative person, your other activities and things. Let me begin with a very simple question. You mention in your book that in a sense, your daughter has been the protagonist of this book. Why? We are curious to know, why do you use the term in a sense?
Yeah, thank you.
What was the trigger?
Yes, thank you for that question. Really perceptive. So when I started work on the book, the idea was to write about my experiences as the parent of a child with an invisible disability, namely dyslexia. Because when my daughter was around 6 years old, she was diagnosed with dyslexia. And ever since, for several years, for about 20 years or so, as a family, we faced several challenges. So the idea was to really write about that, because parents of children with disabilities, both invisible as well as visible disabilities, just don't have a voice. I mean, there is just really no forum where they can talk about what they go through, the struggles that they face, the struggles that the child faces, and therefore by extension you as a parent or especially a mother faces. Right? So as a writer, I felt that there was a gap in the bookshelf, so to speak. Right? So that kind of a book which I would have liked to read did not exist. Oh, cool. And I felt that one of the things I ought to do, given that I had already certain skills as a writer, was to put those skills to use and write the kind of book that I didn't see out there anywhere. Right?
So how have you structured the book? Are these lessons or chapters, or what is the subtext?
Yes. So as I said, so initially it began really as a sort of a set of journal entries almost about my experiences. So it began with an essay, which is also called This Kind of a Child. And then it sort of organically grew. It became a set of interleaved short stories based on the life of a child with dyslexia and her mother, right? Largely autobiographical stories, not completely, but largely. So that was the kernel of the book. And I realized as I started working on those stories and the essays that this story was not just mine, right? This was the kind of story that is taking place actually across India, across the world. The story of disability is not something that is new. It has been told, but it hasn't been told well enough. So I sort of looked outwards from myself, from my own narrow little field of experience, to the lives of others with other sorts of disabilities, to the lives of parents with children with other kinds of disabilities. And I asked the question, what does that mean? Right? What does that experience really mean on the whole? So that is what the book became eventually.
You put it so well. If we look at the sub-segments, there's one particular chapter which is very intriguingly worded, and that is words like swords. So is it literal? I mean, words that prick you or something like that?
Yes, so that particular essay was written by my daughter because at some point, when she turned 18, I said, look, this is a book that I've been wanting to bring out. And is it okay if I do that? And she said, not only is it okay, I'll also sort of contribute a piece to it. And she wrote this piece. And in that piece, she talks about how hurtful the words that her teachers used to talk about her. They would call her an idiot. They would say, look, you haven't got enough sufficient scores because you're lazy, you don't know enough, all sorts of abusive things, which were very, very hurtful. And I think for her as a child, she felt as though those words were swords. So that's where the title came from. And I chose to retain the title.
Does dyslexia, in this particular case, was it just about, was it slow learning? Or I just noticed this cover has been done so thoughtfully. This kind of child, and it looks exactly as a dyslexic child would inscribe on a piece of paper. So was it general learning disability, or the ability to particularly decipher words and reproduce words? What exactly was it?
Right. There are a lot of misconceptions actually, unfortunately, about dyslexia. So dyslexia is not necessarily slow learning. It's what we call a specific learning deficit. Right. So as in the issues with the children with dyslexia typically have issues with reading and writing and processing text. This does not, however, affect their overall level of intelligence or their IQ or their ability to grasp things. So it's really a mismatch between overall intelligence and the ability to perform on a piece of paper, to write on a piece of paper, or to read off a piece of text. So this was the thing, which basically means that in a school system context or in college, they have difficulties getting good grades and finishing school or finishing college or whatever. But on the other hand, if you test them orally, they do very well. Right? So this is what we call a specific learning difficulty, and it can be supported and addressed by different kinds of interventions.
How has your daughter, I mean, it's a very sensitive question, but how has your daughter, responded to the book?
Yeah, so she's actually really excited because the book has, I'm really fortunate in that it has received really good welcome and very good reviews. And a number of reviewers have actually talked about her work as being a very moving piece of work. And in fact, there are college students who are now reading that. So I think she's actually quite delighted about what it has done, because I don't think she, or for that matter, I thought that this is going to be a book that people will actually read,
My second question might come across as a throwback question. Why were you diagnosed homesick in Santa Cruz?
Yeah, so I grew up in Chennai, Hyderabad, Kanpur, different parts of India.
And Ranchi,
Ranchi was where I was born, right? So I think in a sense, my whole, the way I thought of myself was as someone I was very rooted, I think, in India in some ways, right? And my first ever trip abroad, overseas, was when I got the Fulbright. And that was actually my first flight. Back then flying was not as common as it is now. And for me, everything was new. The country was new, the United States. I had never seen a supermarket up until then. And I really felt acutely homesick. And what felt like, okay, this is not so different from home after all, was the fact that there was a sea there. And I had grown up in Chennai, so for me, the sea was a point of connection. So seeing the sea meant that, I could feel a little bit more connected to where I was than I did before.
But then it seems being diagnosed homesick comes as a blessing here, because it proves to be a tipping point of sorts. To a new journey altogether.
Yes. And I think I gradually grew less homesick, more used to things there. But I think there was always an urge in me to come back to where I felt.
Tell us something more about the poem that you wrote.
Yeah.
Of the same title.
Yes. So, so this poem. So, when I went on the Fulbright, I was actually sent to the University of California at Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz is a beautiful little university town. It has redwood forests. It has the sea, the ocean, as I mentioned, and also hills. So it's spectacularly beautiful.
Right.
And in a sense, I felt very lucky to be there. But as I said, I think the first 2 or 3 months, I was very homesick, and friends would say, oh, this is just that you're homesick. I would say things like, the sugar in this country is not as sweet as the sugar back home. And they would say, no, it can't be true. You're just homesick. Right? And so that's what I meant by diagnosed homesick. It was like a diagnosis. But I think gradually, like it happens to most immigrants or people who travel to another place, I settled into the place a little. And I think I warmed up to it the time, I think by the first time I visited the ocean there by Santa Cruz, the beach. And I said, yes, this is actually the same sea that I see back home as well. The water is the same water that flows everywhere, all around the world. And maybe it is not such an alien country after all, and maybe I will feel comfortable here. Right? So that's what the poem is about.
Let out a secret, if I may ask you this. Does a poet graduate to be a novelist, or a novelist graduates to be a poet? What is the connection?
Yeah, so I think I always felt that this urge in me to try out different kinds of genres, right? So though I started my writing life as a poet, and I wrote mostly poetry, I was also writing some short fiction, and this novel kind of happened. It grew out of partly my experiences in Santa Cruz, partly my life in India, and it happened, right? That's
no,
how
but sorry to interrupt you, but logically, shouldn't the short story be a bridge between the poem and the novel?
Yes, it should be. But I think I did actually write a few short stories. I didn't publish them. But yeah, you're right. So there was poetry, then there was some short fiction, and then the novel happened. So I guess it did happen like that, in that order to some extent.
But your long journey in translation is again very intriguing to us. I mean, writing is something that we all understand, but translation is a different ballgame altogether. I would like you to tell our viewers your journey of your multilingual translation.
So that was an accident, really a serendipitous accident, if you like, because some years ago, I had the good fortune of meeting the translator Lakshmi Holmstrom. She's a very well-known translator. She would translate from Tamil into English. And she and Srilata Krishnan, who went on to becoming my co-translators and co-editors of The Rapids of a Great River, the Penguin Book of Tamil Poetry, convinced me to enter this translation project. And I wasn't convinced because I had actually grown up going to school, going to Kendriya Vidyalaya. So my formal language, second language was Hindi right through rather than Tamil.
Oh, okay.
And I did learn Tamil. I spoke Tamil at home. And
do you speak Hindi as well?
I speak some Hindi as well. It's kind of a bit rusty now, but I used to be fairly fluent as a younger person. And so in that sense, there was not much formal training as such in Tamil. So I was very hesitant. But Lakshmi Holmstrom actually convinced me, and she said, look, as a poet, I think it would be good to have your strengths here in this project. And so that's how I started, quite hesitantly. And I found it kind of grew on me, because it meant that then I suddenly started to slowly read in Tamil, a language which I hadn't read much of earlier, and so on. And then also my mother started to write. She's a poet and a novelist. She started quite late in life. And more as a labor of love than a professional thing, I started translating her work. So that also, so 2 of her novels, The Scent of Happiness and Once There Was a Girl, have been published in English, one by Ratna Books and the other by Writers Workshop. And I've also translated her poems. Her name is Vatsala. So that was something that, again, I mean, I don't think I did it like thinking, okay, this is some professional thing I'm doing, but it's something I just enjoyed doing. So that's how it happened.
Let us now book a table for 4. Tell our viewers more about Table for 4, its journey, and the award that it fetched you.
Yeah. So when I started...
Your first novel, is it?
That was my first novel. When I first started work on it, I was in my late 30s, and I was quite busy because I had just sort of joined IIT Madras as a assistant professor, and I had 2 young children to look after, and it's the usual life of any working mother, as you can imagine, no? Running between office and home. And so I would wake up quite early. I would wake up at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the mornings and set aside some time, about an hour before the children woke up, the household woke up or whatever, and I would work on this. So it was a very slow process because I didn't have that much time, So it took about 4 years, I think, in all, and it saw several drafts. It went through several drafts before it became what I felt was, a full manuscript of a novel. And at that point, the Man Asian Literary Prize, invited even unknown writers and unknown novelists, like I was an unknown novelist at the time, to submit manuscripts for the prize, which I did. And to my surprise, it got listed for the longlisted for the award.
You'd come back to India by then.
I had come back to India. So it was really written in retrospect, after I came back. And I think I needed time to process some of the experiences I'd had. And I'd come back to India and I wrote it at that time. Yes.
Okay. If I say Seablue Child, Arriving Shortly, Writing Octopus, or Bookmarking the Oasis, what memories come back to you?
Yeah, so each of these books is a different point in my life journey, I guess. Seablue Child is always, innocence, I guess, will be my favorite child, if you like, because it was my first time actually ever that I had a book out, and I felt like, okay, maybe...
Do writers actually consider their creations as children?
It is like that, I think. It is like that, And Bookmarking the Oasis, I think by the time I got to writing that, I had already been published as a poet. Table for Four was special again because it was my first novel, and it just kind of, I was fortunate in that. So, and that a good publisher picked it up, like Penguin.
Hey, I just forgot to ask you, in Santa Cruz Diagnosed Homesick, that too fetched you an international...
Yeah, it was a National Poetry Society of India award. Yeah, that was the award that it got, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Coming to, you just mentioned IIT Madras where you were teaching.
Yeah.
To a common mind, when you mention a name like IIT, immediately, visuals of scientists and would-be scientists come to mind. Or even your tenure at the Chennai Mathematical Institute. It's so difficult to understand somebody who's 24 hours into mathematics or pure science and technology. How does your area of work kind of gel with their kind of pressures?
Right.
What do they do with it?
Yeah. So that's a good question, actually. So one of the good things I think about IIT system, the IIT system itself, was that there's the humanities, which included, of course, literature. There was always some kind of a compulsory component that BTech students had to do. And it just made them, I think, better rounded individuals. They were not, usually in engineering colleges in India, you only do science or you only do engineering subjects. Again, at the Chennai Mathematical Institute.
This was more interesting because pure maths and pure arts.
That's right. So there at the Chennai Mathematical Institute, there was always an interest in the arts, in music, in literature, and so on. And so I said, okay, why not you leverage that and set up a small writing residency, and also, talks and workshops and readings by writers, also concerts by musicians. So we often have that. So we have what's called the Chennai Mathematical Institute's Arts Initiative.
Okay.
Right. So there is, I think, a very important space for the arts in these in CMI, actually, always.
Anything interesting if you were to compare the response of IIT students versus the response of pure maths Chennai Mathematical Institute students? Could we draw something interesting out of this comparison?
Yeah, so IIT, of course, as you know, is a very large institute with a large number of students, whereas CMI is a smaller institute, fewer students. So the kind of interaction is different. So IIT, you would have a lot of numbers. I mean, a lot more people would attend, right? But with CMI, I think there would be a smaller audience, but the small audience would be very deeply engaged with anything that was happening. I think that I could pick up as a difference.
I think their brains are programmed to kind of think that way.
Yes.
You could throw some light on the Yavanika Press initiative also.
Right. So I was for a short while, on the editorial committee of Yavanika. This is a independent press, not supported by anybody, no salaries, or it's a voluntary thing that we all did. And so we used to bring out chapbooks of poetry, haiku, which is a Japanese form, and so on. So there would be an online version as well as a few printed copies, right? And actually, there are so many talented poets in India who write in English, who write in different languages. But as you know, not enough people willing to publish it, because poetry does not sell. It doesn't get the publisher that kind of return of investment. So it's really up to usually small presses, and Yamanika was one of them, actually. Yes.
So, what kind of publications have you dealt with at Yavanika?
Typically, first-time writers, not so well-known poets. As I said, haiku, which is a form that's very specialized.
And all languages?
No, English, primarily
Okay,
English.
okay.
Yes.
Again, as I said, protagonist of this interaction, your latest book, This Kind of Child, The Disability Story. It's a topic, if you go by the title, it comes across as a compelling comment on a particular, trend in society, a social more that you have commented on. If you take a gist of that particular, tendency of human beings, how will you define it, which led to the creation of this book?
Yes. So I think that overall the tendency in society is to view...
Or schools for that matter.
Or schools, is to view people with any sort of disability as people who are different from themselves, right? So I think this is also the way I used to think. I mean, so it's not, I'm not sort of blaming others or anything like that. But I think if you really think about it carefully, a disability becomes a disability only if there is a lack of support. So for instance, if there is a person in a wheelchair and there is not a ramp, there is only a staircase that appears, the physical impairment becomes a disability, because he or she is then not able to climb up the stairs because they can't do it with their wheelchairs, right? And in school, in the context of school, if a child with dyslexia is not supported in her learning needs, then she becomes a child with a disability, which otherwise need not be a disability, because people with dyslexia have big picture thinking, they have other strengths, right? So that is one thing. So I think that is the thinking that, we need to perhaps work against. And the other point I would like to make here is that all of us, right, even those of us who feel, okay, no, we are not disabled, we are normal, or whatever we feel, right? One day all of us are going to grow old, right? And maybe by the time you get to be 60 or 70 or 80 or whatever, you're going to be not able to walk that well. Maybe your hearing will be a little bit impaired, or your eyesight might not be so good. So many things can happen to our bodies as we grow
universal.
older. It's universal. So there is that acquired disability, right? So we're all going to suddenly not be able to, my mother can no longer climb a bus, public transport, because it's too high, the step for her, right? So in that limited way, she's disabled, if you think about it, though she's not a person with a disability in that sense. So it's going to happen to all of us. So we can acquire disability as we age. We can also have a temporary disability. Say, if you have an accident, then you have to walk with a crutch, or you have to have your arm in a cast. You may not be able to perhaps pick up this glass of water, for instance, and maybe somebody has to help you. So these are also, it's good to therefore think of all of us as being on the same planet of, where disability could happen to us as well, right? And when you think about it like that, you stop thinking about people with disabilities as somehow being so different from you, because they are not. They're really not. And they are as able as we are, but maybe in other ways.
Other ways, yes. Yes, of course. During the journey of its making, did you actually get to meet a lot of people to interview them, to know them more, something like that?
Yes, I did. That was one of the...
If you go by the various segments of the book.
That's right. So that is one of the, I think, good things about having embarked on this journey of the book, is that I met so many wonderful people, and that they were so generous to the extent that they allowed me into their lives. Even though they were so short on time, especially parents of children with, say, autism and severe disabilities, or even people with disabilities themselves who are activists, Rajiv Rajan and Deepak Patsardi. They were so generous with their time, with their comments, with their thoughts, and they actually taught me how to look at this whole question very differently from when I began working on this book. So I'm deeply grateful to their presence, and I met as you said, I met a number of people, sometimes organically. So I would meet one person. So I met Namita, who then put me on to Chetna, who put me on to somebody else, right? So that is how it kind of grew. And I said, okay, I'm not going to stop with this. I'm just going to follow the trail, and see where it leads me. I think that was good.
Our interaction, Srilata, will be incomplete without you kind of doing the honors and choosing a passage to be read out by you.
Sure. Thank you. I'll do that. So I'll maybe read to you from just an excerpt from this essay, which is also called This Kind of Child, because, as I said, it began with that. I thought it would be interesting for viewers as well. This Kind of Child. I distinctly remember that bleak November day in 2013, the skies grey and grieving, just as I was for my daughter, whom we had pulled out of school a couple of months ago. There she lay huddled under a light quilt, unmindful of the blare of school bus horns, seemingly oblivious to the life that was passing her by. I grieved because I was convinced that she would never find her way back into the maze that counted as education. It seemed to me that she was lost, and hopelessly so. If the liberal Montessori school to which we had admitted her could fail her so badly, what chance did she have in any other? And, by extension, what chance really did she have in this difficult world? She had joined India's millions of left-behind children, and it didn't seem to me at the time that she would ever catch up with the rest. Dyslexia, or whatever it was that passed for it, had failed her. It had tripped her up. As I sat at her bedside that morning, it occurred to me that my daughter had no place to turn to, that the four of us, her father, her brother, her grandmother and I, would somehow have to become that place. Home was the only school that would take her. My daughter was 9 when we took her out of school. I couldn't help thinking of her first day at school. She had gone in with sparkling eyes and feet that danced to music that only she could hear. My husband's aunt remarked once that she was like a small butterfly with her light and happy movements. All through those early school years, I had read to her and to my son stories and poems at bedtime and whenever the opportunity presented itself. My son became an independent reader at some point. This transition had been so smooth, so organic that I had barely noticed. As for my daughter, she clearly enjoyed listening to the stories I read her and knew them all by heart. She had a great sense of the spoken word, often spoke in metaphors herself, and had sound literary judgment, except that reading and writing did not come to her easily.
Very poignantly put. And
thank you.
There's something very universal about it. I mean, the way you've portrayed it. After This Kind of Child, any other, idea germing up in your mind?
Yes, I am actually working on a sequence of poems. I don't know if, I'll publish it or what will happen to it, but it's really a sequence of poems based on the women characters in the Mahabharata, broadly speaking.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so that's my project now.
Well, Srilata, that brings us to the conclusion of this little conversation, this little interaction that we had. So, friends, I'm sure you have learnt as much as I have. Every interaction, every studio recording teaches you something new. And on that note, I thank K. Srilata for having come to Delhi all the way from Chennai and taking out time for us. Wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.